the world's oldest joke.
A man comes home after work and he says to his wife, "Here, I've just met the butcher, and he tells me he's made love to every single woman in our street except one." "Well," she says, "that'll be that stuck-up cow at number 21. Well, it's a tough choice, but I have to say that's one of my all-time favourite gags. Belongs to Max Miller and it's probably 60 years old, but it still makes me laugh.
Please forgive me, I'm very tired. I've been shoplifting. And some of those shops are very heavy, I tell you.
Sir, the slave who has sold me has just died. My God, he never did such a thing when he belonged to me.
In fact, is there such a thing as a new joke? I look at what made the Romans roar and what tickled the Tudors.
There's a lot of jockeying for social position in telling a joke.
I've got a friend who's got a butler whose left arm is missing. Serves him right.
In ancient Greece, for instance, there was a joke club in which people would exchange jokes.
Morning, Socrates! Morning, Plato.
There's a lot to offend if you're not careful.
Not very PC.
No.
We're here to see whether old jokes can be funny.
I've been advertising for a while, but I've had 500 replies, all from married men offering me theirs.
There is no such thing as an old joke. Only jokes that people have heard before.
Do jokes pass across the centuries as easily as they travel around the internet? I intend to find out as I go in search of the world's oldest joke. Wisecrack, gag, quip, jape, jest, pun. Call it what you like, sharing a joke is one of the most effective ways we bond with our fellow human beings. But how do we define a joke? For me, there's one man who can answer that question better than anyone else. What is a joke?
A joke. Well, there are many different kinds of jokes. If you look in the dictionary, a joke will tell you a joke is a jest.
Advice to make people laugh. Are any accountants in the audience?
There's one there. What's black and brown that looks good on an accountant? A Rottweiler. If you look way back to the origin of the word joke, you'll find that in Old English, it really meant a trinket, a jewel.
So my granddad used to say to me, "Mike, don't watch your money, watch your health." And one day, whilst I was watching my health, someone stole my money. It was my granddad.
To me, a joke is like a very expensive watch. Can I have a look at yours, please? Yes. Gosh. Gosh. If you take an expensive watch and just very carefully lift the back off, you'll see the mechanism, all little balances and wheels and timings, and that's what a joke is. That's why a joke has to be very carefully used.
Two cannibals in the jungle having lunch together. One says to the other one, "I don't like your wife." And the other one says, "Well, just eat the chips then."
It can be a story, it can be an anecdote, it can be a rhyme, it can be a jingle. It's like saying the word music. They're all different kinds of music. There's all different kinds of jokes.
What's this? I don't.
Happiness, pleasure not quite the same thing, because happiness is more important. Happiness brings with contentment and satisfaction.
And jokes can satisfy that need.
Well, jokes are really tickling the mind. Tickling the mind.
A polar bear walks into a bar and says to the barman, "How much for a pint of bitter?" And the barman says to him, "Well, that'll be £6, please." And the polar bear says, "Well, how much for a glass of house red wine?" And the barman says, "Well, that'll be £9. And what about a vodka, lime and lemonade?" And the barman says, "Well, that'll be £13.50. The barman says to him, "I hope you don't mind, but we don't often get polar bears in here." And the polar bear says, "Well, at these prices, I'm not bloody surprised."
When you stand on a stage and you actually tell a joke and an audience laughs, that's a wonderful feeling. It's a wonderful feeling.
it's a birthday treat. Come on. Asking for affection, asking for love, asking for appreciation. That's what teenagers do. That's me do. A fella went to the police station and said he'd been robbed by an elephant. And the police sergeant said, well, was it an Indian elephant with little ears? Or was it an African elephant with big ears? He said, I don't know, it had a stocking over its head.
Can we learn from the joke books of the past?
Oh, I think so, yes. I once got permission to visit and spend some time in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Because I wanted to know what is a laugh? Why do people laugh? How can you create laughter? What is a joke? I wanted to know this, so I read all the books I could. I've read some fabulous.
Going back how far?
Oh, as far as the library had books on it. Sigmund Freud wrote a book called Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. The trouble is that Freud never played second house Friday night on Glasgow Empire.
This poor traffic warden, you know, he popped his clogs. He stepped off a traffic warden, and they had him all boxed up, and then they were lowering him into the hole, and while he was there, suddenly he came to life. He came to life, and he knocked on the lid. And they brought him up again, and they opened the lid, and he sat up. He said, I'm alive, I'm alive. The vicar said, I'm sorry, sir, I've started the paperwork.
Nowadays, you can find a joke about any subject, but it wasn't always the case. In 1949, the BBC issued the Green Book, which laid out strict rules on what was and wasn't acceptable to joke about.
There's an absolute ban on the following: lavatories, effeminacy in men, immorality of any kind, suggestive references to honeymoon couples, chambermaids, fig leaves, prostitution, ladies' underwear, e.g. winter drawers on, animal habits, e.g. rabbits, lodgers, commercial travellers, and extreme care should be taken in dealing with references to or jokes about prenatal influences, e.g. his mother was frightened by a donkey.
To find out how much jokes have changed since that infamous Green Book, I've come to see my old friend Barry Cryer, joke teller and joke writer. Over the years, do you hear the same jokes coming round?
Oh, yes.
Decade after decade?
The names change. A joke with a name in it will always be used as a formula. I remember back in the 60s saying about Harold Wilson, if he fell off a cliff, he'd swear he was going up. This is just a formula line, but I've used it about Tony Blair and
Nick Clegg.
Nick Clegg. How'd you save George Osborne from drowning?
I don't know, how do you?
Take your foot off his head.
Are old jokes just being reclothed, redressed up as new, with new references, contemporary references, but the basic joke is centuries old?
Old good jokes answer to the form. Set it up, set the scene, something happens during the scene, and it ends with a surprise. Oh, I must write that down. A judge who stopped a case stone cold in the middle of the afternoon apologised to the counsel and the jury and the witnesses and said, we've got to adjourn until tomorrow. I've left my notes on this case in a file at home in the country. And one of the counsel stood up and said, fax it up, my lad. He said, yes, it does rather, doesn't it? So, we move on.
Some jokes endure, some don't.
Yes.
Why?
Some of the best jokes are timeless. They're just about human nature. Some jokes just go away because they're about pounds, shillings and pence or a topical theme at the time. But the really great jokes are just about human nature, so you can keep telling them.
Bloke's been on a night out, he's so drunk, he's thrown up all over himself. He's like, oh, what am I going to do? His mate says, don't worry, listen, when you go home to the wife, stick 20 quid in your pocket, say someone else threw up on you, yeah? And they're giving you 20 quid for the dry cleaning. Bloke's like, brilliant, goes home, walks in. Wife goes, you've thrown up. He's like, no, look, someone threw up on me, and they're giving me £20 for the dry cleaning. She goes, but why is there £40 there? He goes, the other £20 is from the guy who shit in my pants.
In the 1960s, a new kind of comedian arrived to rival the traditional joke tellers.
Do you know what they call a tall, suave, sophisticated, coloured, highly educated university professor with 3 degrees in nuclear physics in Alabama? nigger.
Jokes became less formulaic and more political. With the emergence of alternative comedy in the 1980s, joke-telling was firmly out of fashion.
We still have the same government, even though we had an election, we have the same government. Mrs. Thatcher stormed Parliament for the third time. We better be careful. If she wins it again, they're going to have to let her keep it.
Jokes remained in real life, they always will do, but I think it was suddenly regarded as, not suddenly, gradually regarded as rather old-fashioned, telling jokes, and a great breed of performers who just talked about life and did routines about life. And people thought, oh, this is refreshing.
Being Scottish, a lot of people think I'm a drunk. And this is nonsense. I just do drunk impersonations, you know, to make people feel cosy-wozy in the company of a Scotsman, you know. And it's quite easy. Scotsmen, drunk Scotsmen, especially drunk Glaswegians, walk with one leg, like that.
People writing their own material. It was all part of a change. Sea change was happening around that time.
And they ask everybody if they're all right all the time. Yeah, right? Yeah, I'm all right. Who's talking to you?
On a personal level, jokes travel from text to email to dinner party, and we neither know nor care who wrote them as long as they're funny. Until the middle of the 20th century, this was also true for professional comics who would
lift jokes and even whole routines from their peers. So, ladies and gentlemen, you might have heard this joke told before, but not as beautifully as I do it.
However, with the introduction of television and dedicated comedy clubs, a joke became irrevocably associated with the first person to tell it. I've come to see Tim Vine for a modern comedian's thoughts on the subject. How many jokes do you actually know, and how many have you written, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I've probably written, I don't know, maybe a couple of thousand or something.
Robin Hood came up to me. I said, where'd you keep your arrows? He said, in a quiver. I said, where'd you keep your arrows?
All these gags that you've given birth to, if you hear another comedian making a living telling your material, don't you get really angry?
When I was doing clubs, it was, you're in a situation where you're more vulnerable in that situation, because someone could, and it's happened and it's very real, I think, people from established comics have sat at the back, writers for established comics have sat at the back of this room with a notepad and written down what some of these comics have said, and then the comics here who would be watching telly one night and suddenly discover someone doing it on the Royal Variety Show. So that sort of thing, naturally is going to
upset you.
Yes, yeah.
You see, the advantage of easy origami is twofold.
With me, I had there was an email that went round saying these are Tommy Cooper jokes, and it was a section of my act, and they weren't Tommy Cooper jokes. They were mine. I'd written them, yeah. And this email, because everyone loves Tommy, rightly, it got very popular. But at the time, me working on the circuit, whenever I got to that patch, there was a period, a couple of years, when I got to that patch, I would occasionally hear someone go, "That's Tommy Cooper joke." Now, obviously, in a situation like that, when you're on the stage and you hear someone in the front, you want to go, "No, it's not. I wrote it." But you don't want to break out of your sort of silly persona.
Today I had dinner with my boss and his wife, and it was a complete disaster. My boss's wife said to me, she said, "Tim, how many potatoes would you like?" I said, "I'd just have one." She says, "All right, you don't have to be polite." I said, "All right then, I'll just have one, you stupid cow."
Once you've told a joke, it gets into the public domain, and people kind of forget where it comes from. They come and tell you your own jokes back to you, and when you're in the supermarket or wherever.
I have had that a couple of times, yeah. I think a taxi driver once said to me that, what do you think of this? All male tennis players are witches. For example, Goran, even he's a witch. And I said, "Oh, yeah. I don't think I had the heart to tell him I made it up, actually. I think I left it. I said, that's very funny.
So I was working in a health food shop. This bloke walked in. He said, "Evening Primrose Oil." I said, "Mr. Vine to you."
One of the heroes of modern joke-telling is Robert Orban, a man who offered all his jokes up for public consumption and saw them used by all the great comics of the day. Well worth travelling 3,500 miles to meet him. Your jokes are quite short.
That's right, one-liners.
One-liners.
But that was not very popular through the years. It's really the fast pace of living that has brought about one-liners.
A book fell on my head. I only have myself to blame.
When you were writing these books, you were just writing jokes, and everybody would take them and adapt them, find the ones that suited their personality.
Absolutely.
So what I'm interested in is how in a room with a blank sheet of paper, you sit down and you're disciplined, you say, I'm going to write 3 jokes today.
For most of my writing life, I wrote 25 jokes a day, 7 days a week, and then pared it down to what I thought was the funniest.
I take my children everywhere. Unfortunately, they find their way home.
In those earlier days, where you're working professionally as a gag writer, the pressure not to write jokes about certain subjects, did that come from the audience, from the advertisers? Were people just afraid of the reaction, or that was just the culture of the time?
The general culture, and that has changed.
And I want to say that the Johnsons are lovely people. I'm very fond of them, particularly Mrs. Johnson. She's so jolly and fat. She's 2 of the finest women I ever saw. To show you how fat she is, she fell down one day and rocked herself to sleep trying to get up.
Sexist jokes no longer work. Women now will boo a comedian who starts getting involved with sexist material.
I used to call my girlfriend Melancholy Baby because she had a head like a melon, face like a collie.
That was not acceptable. Now it's totally not acceptable.
Do you cringe when
Oh, yes. Yes, at one point, we were putting together a Doubleday book that sort of mashed together 4 of my other books. And out of 9,000 jokes that I went through, I threw out 2,000 as being sexist.
I beat my wife up this morning. I got up at 7, she got up at 8.
Should we talk about clowns? For as long as civilization has existed, the comedian too has existed, in the form of a joker, a jester, or clown. Ancient Native Americans believed that only by laughing could you contact the gods, so clowns were present at all religious ceremonies. At the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror's joker was the first man to be killed. He was sent out in front of the troops to provoke the English into attack. Possibly the first comic to die a death literally. Even in Victorian times, a clown was equally at home on a stage as in a circus. Dr. Anne Featherstone recently discovered Victorian clown Thomas Lawrence's gag book, a fascinating and rare example of a 19th century jokesmith's catalogue of works. What this discovery shows is the incredible importance of the joke book to the comedian. When Bob Monkhouse's joke books were stolen, he offered a reward of £10,000 for the return of what he called his precious babies. And that was a hell of a lot of money in those days. Now, Anne, I can see you trembling here. You're very excited.
Yeah.
What is it you've got for us?
I have in my hand a Victorian clown's gag book.
A clown's gag book? Why does a clown need a gag book? Clowns are physical comedians, they're not verbal.
Oh, well, in the 19th century, a clown could be a singing, talking, as well as a physical clown.
If William Penn's aunts had a pie shop, how much would the pies cost? The pie rates of Penn's aunts.
So clowns did jokes?
Yes.
I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong, what you've got here with Lawrence and his ilk is the origins of the stand-up comedian.
Yes.
What's the difference between a rowing boat and Joan of Arc? One's made of wood, the other's made of Orleans.
This is the copy that he has at the side of the ring and flips through really quickly. He knows where the material is.
And this is just full of material, comedy material.
Comedy material, what a clown would call wheezers.
Marriage is like bathing in cold water. One plunge and it's all over.
Is any of it still funny, do you think?
There were certain things which Victorians found funny.
Like
marriage, love, misfortune, and women of all in all shapes and sizes.
You know, I'm very fond of the ladies. I say, bless those wives that fill our lives with little bees and honey. They ease life shocks. They mend our socks. But can't they spend the money?
There may be as many groans as laughs, but you went to the circus to hear the same stuff. You weren't really going there to hear novelty, to hear new jokes. Actually, you were quite happy to hear
The familiar.
the familiar ones over and over and over again.
Bad husbands are like bad coals. They smoke, they go out, and they don't keep the pot boiling.
His audiences were Victorian. You think immediately of prudish, very po-faced, very retentive. So you'd expect the material to be very prim and proper.
No, not really. There's a lot to offend if you're not careful.
Not very PC.
No.
Okay.
No. We've got a wheeze that he calls Blacksmith's Daughter, which is quite a misogynistic piece.
Was that typical of the period?
Oh, yes. He says, yes, she's an uncommon sort of girl. There was a neatness in her style of dress. Did you notice the bonnet? Wasn't it a little duck?
I gave her that.
Then her boots, did you see them?
I gave her that.
And her jacket, did you take notice of that? Wasn't it a beauty?
I gave that.
And her eyes, you must have noticed them. Yes, they were black, says the ringmaster. Yes.
I gave her those.
That would, I guess, would raise a laugh. But we
I'm sure it would,
But
yes.
we might find it a bit awkward these days.
As well as a love of wordplay
And a rather dubious attitude towards women,
Victorian jokes also reveal concerns about new advances in industry.
Did you hear today about the accident? 3 men ran over by a train. They were saved by a miracle. The train was going over a bridge and they were going under it.
And of course, the creation of a police force in 1829 gave them a whole new target.
Policemen are like rainbows. They never appear until the storm is over.
You obviously know the material that's in here.
Yeah.
Do you ever hear it? You watch television or see a movie or go to a show?
and I think if you listen to it, you realise that you've heard this in a sense before, but in a more modern context.
So you have to imagine that Tom's in the middle of the ring and he's got to fill probably 2 minutes. And maybe it's a restless audience. So he needs to do something really dramatic. So he says, "Thou rememberest well the night was dark and tempestuous, when a sudden and terrific storm broke o'er our heads."
I just happened to glance at the night sky, and I marvelled at the millions of stars glistening like pieces of quicksilver thrown carelessly onto black velvet.
The rain fell in torrents, the forked lightning flashed through the murky skies, the horrid artillery of heaven rolled as if it were about to burst the fiery element.
In awe, I watched the waxing moon ride across the zenith of the heavens like an amber chariot toward the ebon void of infinite space, wherein the tethered bolts of Jupiter and Mars hang forever festooned in their orbital majesty.
All nature seemed as though chaos was come again, when a voice, a giant's voice, was heard above the roaring of the waters. A voice sounded from east to west, from north to south, from hill to hill, from cataract to cavern. A voice proclaimed aloud to the affrighted world,
I must put a roof on this lavatory.
"Have you got a clean shirt for Sunday?"
Very well done, well done. Very good. What Thomas Lawrence's joke book highlights is that jokes often rely on social context, so what was funny to one generation is distinctly unfunny to the next. For example, the ancient Greeks liked nothing more than a good lettuce gag. Not many gems there. But how do you make one of those very old jokes funny for today's audience? Is it in the actual words, or is it the way I tell them? I've come to Canterbury to meet Oliver Double, who teaches historical performance and comedy.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Got any new jokes for us?
We're going to join one of his classes as they attempt to breathe new life into some very old jokes.
We're here to see whether
old jokes can be funny.
So I've brought with
It's
me...
never held me back.
Well, absolutely. Okay. So I brought some old joke books. This is One-Liners by Robert Orban that was published in 1951. My Best Scotch Stories by Sir Harry Lauder, one of the music hall greats. That's from 1929. And I've got Lewis and Faye Copeland's 10,000 Jokes, Toasts and Stories, which actually contains 10,065. We're going to do a vocal warm-up now, because one of the things about comedians from decades past was that their delivery was often more formal than you get now.
Think no mic.
Yeah, exactly. If you had no mic, you've got to be heard right at the back of the Hackney Empire or whatever. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with resonators. You can make different parts of your body resonate to make it louder, and that makes your voice sound a different way.
Have you had anything?
Oh, it's funny you should say that. No.
You sound very posh.
No, wait. Oh, thank you.
Bit of a ladies' man is what I tend to do with my day. Really?
I do find that voice attractive.
Oh, well, do you, Michael?
No, not terribly.
Well, I don't know then. Maybe I'll have more success with a higher voice. How about up here? How about now?
No, I think it needs to be
bit lower.
deeper. The deeper the better.
Okay. Right.
There was a great joke about a fella goes into a pub and he says, "Excuse me, ma'am," and he says, "Can I have a pint of beer, please?" And the barman says, "Certainly, sir." And he looks at him. And he says, "Are you taking the piss out of me?" And the barman says, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not taking the piss. I wouldn't talk like that." "Oh, all right, yeah." So then RAF guy comes in. "I say, barman," he says, "a large gin and tonic, a dash of Angostura, please." The barman says, "Certainly, sir. Right away. That'll be 3 and 9. Thank you very much, sir." "Thank you very much," says the other. "Yeah," says the other. He said, "I told you were taking the piss out of me." He said, "No," he says the barman. "I was taking the piss out of me."
There's a lot of jockeying for social position in telling a joke, which is why it can be a bit scary even just telling a joke to a group of strangers that you've not met before, because if it falls flat, your stock has fallen now, and people think of you a little bit sadder than they thought of you before. On the other hand, if it gets a huge laugh, then your stock has gone up. I would like to think of a joke from the jokes you've been given from the books, and I'd like you to think about how you could tell it, and also thinking about how you can really punch it home by getting the rhythm.
Make it funny.
Yeah.
Why do you always call your wife Honey, Mr. Brown? Well, Honey has always disagreed with me.
Did you hear about the awful fright George got at his wedding?
Oh, yes, I was there. I saw her.
I said to the wife, "I'm homesick." She said, "You're home?" I said, "Yeah, I know, and I'm sick of it."
So do you think you could tell those jokes now?
Ironically.
Would you take that joke, basic joke,
I'll take the basic joke.
and turn it into something?
I did that with quite a few of them. I kind of scribbled other ones. "I'd like a room for my wife and myself." And he goes, "Sweet, sir?" And he goes, "Yes, she's rather perfect." Which I thought was far too twee, so I said, "Oh, no, she's a pain in the arse."
Some of them are just devastatingly sinister. Like, for example, there's this one which I've never speak of the dead unless you have something good to say about them. Well, my wife is dead. Good.
Is there a sort of PC filter reading these jokes?
It's colloquialisms and stuff that just go really over the head.
Young husband, I see that sugar has gone down 2 points. Young wife, has it? I'll get a couple of pounds today then.
But likewise, some of them are good, I think. There's one that's, "Good morning, Mrs. Smith, I'm from the gas company. I understand there's something in the house that won't work." Yes, he's upstairs. And I like that. It really made me chuckle when I read that first time.
It's one form of entertainment that everybody participates in, don't they? Everybody tells jokes in the office, in the pub, at football, at bingo, wherever you are.
Yeah, it is folkloric, and actually even some sort of new ones as well. That's really weird.
Are there any new jokes?
Well, what I'm talking about is when there's a disaster or something topical happens, the jokes start maybe 12 hours after it's come on the news. Now, we know that they travel via Facebook and the internet and text and all that, and sort of viral emails and all that stuff. But that used to happen. It used to happen 20, 30 years ago before the internet. And it's just bizarre. How can those jokes be generated so quickly, and how can they travel so quickly? I have an image of one really sick guy in a cellar with a laptop, just going, "Ha ha ha!"
Watching the news.
Yeah, just going, "Yeah, 10 people died in a fire," and then just somehow psychically beaming it into people's minds.
What did Osama bin Laden cook on MasterChef? I don't know. You tell me. Big apple crumble.
The joke books used by the university students may now seem out of date, but look in the humour section of any bookshop and you'll see that joke books are still hugely popular. Probably the most famous English joke book is Joe Miller's Jests, published about 300 years ago and still in print today.
A famous teacher of arithmetic, who had long since been married, without being able to get his wife with child, once said to her, "Madam, your husband is an excellent arithmetician." "Yes," replied she, "only you can't multiply."
However, it's not just the contents that are of interest. The book itself is one of the most successful jokes in history. Joe Miller's Jests, first published in 1739 and named after a famous stage comedian, was actually released the year after his death in a bid to cash in on his fame. Reprinted and added to many times, the original edition contained jokes about everything from Irishmen, bad breath, loose women, to lawyers. The real joke, though, known only to his closest friends, was that off stage, Joe was as serious as they come. He was the world's worst joke teller, and he could neither read nor write.
A gentleman said of a young wench who constantly plied her trade round the temple that if she'd had as much law in her head as she had in her tail, then she'd be one of the ablest counsel in England.
And so it was that Joe Miller, who'd never told a jest in his life, became the author of so many jokes past and present in a book he'd never heard of and which he couldn't read anyway.
An Irish lawyer, having occasion to go to dinner, left these directions written: "I have gone to the Elephant and Castle, where you shall find me. And if you don't know how to read, take this to a stationer's, where he will read it for you."
Like so many historical documents, the fact that a joke's written down usually means it has a much older oral history, so they're very hard to date. But we can trace some old jokes back to the very first time they're in print. The most famous joke of all time, "Why did the chicken cross the road?" first appeared in the March 1847 issue of New York Monthly magazine. And other popular jokes can be traced back to even earlier texts. The Elizabethans, for example, loved a good laugh. So much so they created the first English joke book, The 100 Merry Tales. I'm hoping that English professor Carol Rutter is going to tell me a lot more. Carol, The Merry Tales, what is it and where does it come from?
It was published in 1526, and it's a compendium of merry stories that talk about stupid priests, talk about children who can't learn things, talk about dumb wives.
At a merchant's house in London, there lived a maid who was big with child. The mistress of the house commanded her to tell her who was the father of the child. The maid answered, "Forsooth, nobody." "What?" exclaimed the mistress. "Well, this is not possible. Some man must be the father." The maid answered, "Why, mistress? Why can't I have a child without a man, just as the hen lays eggs without a cock?"
Are they bawdy, scatological?
Of course, because of course that's one of the things that we adore about the joke in making us consult our own humanity. We spend so much time in our mental faculties. The joke reminds us that we're human, that we have lower parts.
What is the most cleanliest leaf? The holly leaf, because no one will wipe their arse with it.
I think that the culture I'm looking at when I'm reading these tales is much, much closer to real body functions that we, of course, have put into cabinets. So we've put them, as it were, off camera all the time.
A young gentleman of 20 years talked with a gentlewoman who happened to look upon his beard, which, being young, was somewhat over his lip, but very little beneath. So she said to him, "Sir, ye have beard above, but none below." And he, hearing her, so said in sport, "Madam, ye have beard beneath, but none above." "Marry," quoth she, then said one against the other, which made the gentleman so abashed, he had not one word to answer.
Apart from the stock figures of stupid clergymen and unfaithful wives, mass immigration from Wales in Tudor times also meant the introduction of the Welshman as a figure of ridicule.
There lived in heaven a group of Welshmen, whose babbling and boasting annoyed everybody there. God then told St. Peter that he was weary of these Welshmen and would be glad to have them out of heaven. St. Peter then ran out through the heavenly gates and cried out in a loud voice, "Roasted cheese!" This being a delicacy of which Welshmen are very fond. They all ran out of heaven at a brisk pace. St. Peter, seeing the whole group outside, suddenly re-entered heaven, locked the gates, thus keeping the Welshmen out of heaven.
And then, interestingly, because this is a Tudor book, these tales also include a little tag at the end that help you moralize the tale.
And by this tale, we may see that man is not wise to set his mind too much on delicacies or earthly pleasures, for in this he may lose his celestial and eternal joy.
100 Merry Tales is also known as Shakespeare's jest book, because he was known to borrow liberally from it. But more importantly to us, perhaps, the Bard gives us the very first written example of a type of joke still told. It's very comforting, isn't it, that the English have had a sense of humour all the way back to Tudor times.
Not a lot's changed.
Knock, knock.
Who's that?
Europe.
Europe who?
No, Europe who?
Have you heard the one about the papal secretary? He came to London and got the piles, and at the same time he revived the lost art of joke-telling. His name was Poggio Bracciolini, and he stayed here in London at the town house of the Bishop of Winchester, which is right behind me. No wonder he got the farmers. The Farmer Giles piles, you see. Poggio is a very, very important figure in the history of the joke, and if it weren't for Poggio, I suspect that many of today's comedians would not be working. Who was he? First of all,
Yes, the most important. So he was born in 1380 in a little town near Florence.
By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was in Rome with a job as a scriptor in the papal court. He and his friends and his enemies within the sort of civil service in the papal court
would get together after a long day's work and exchange insults and stories and jokes.
The good people of Tivoli were once harangued by an imprudent monk who thundered in a long and furious speech against the sin of adultery. Among other things, he declared that the violation of the sanctity of wedlock was a crime of such grave character that he would rather lie with 10 virgins than 1 married woman. And many of those present were of the same opinion.
he had the idea of writing them all down.
He wrote them
the
down.
first great joke book.
Exactly. He wrote them down years later. He wanted to remember some of these funny stories.
One day, the sea being rough, all those aboard the ship were ordered by the captain to throw overboard their heaviest belongings. There was among them a man who took hold of his wife to cast her overboard, for, he said, she was the heaviest and most burdensome thing he possessed.
The Liber Facetiarum, usually called simply the Facetiae, was the first volume of its kind to be published in Europe. It contains fat jokes, drunk jokes, sex jokes, and fart jokes, as well as a lot of jokes about randy or corrupt priests.
An old bishop, who I knew, complained that he'd lost a number of his teeth already, and that the others were shaking so badly that he feared he would lose those also. At this, a man of the district said, "You shall not fear, you will not lose your teeth." "Why not?" asked the bishop curiously. "Well, my testicles have been hanging loose these last 40 years, seeming at the point of falling off, yet I've never lost them."
The reason why we don't have a lot of joke books from the 600 or 700 years before Poggio is because the monks, the monasteries, had a bit of a monopoly on book production. Because it was expensive and because they held...
labour-intensive.
It was very
Took
labour-intensive,
forever.
yeah. For all we know, they may have told a lot of jokes. I mean, I suspect they probably did. Human beings do.
One day, in order to entertain Lorenzo de' Medici, an ambassador brought a boy of some 5 or 6 years who had extraordinary talent and wit. When the boy had made everyone wonder, Lorenzo turned to the ambassador and asked him what he thought of the child. "The boy's brains will be grown for certain when he is grown up. But," replied the ambassador, "children who are very clever when they are little become very dull and commonplace when they are grown." The boy turned to the ambassador and said, "Why, sir,
you must be extremely clever when you were little."
He did actually come to London at one point.
He did. He came to London in around about 1420. He absolutely hated it.
Oh.
He wrote letters home complaining about the people. They were stupid and ignorant and didn't like books.
As much as he did
and the weather was terrible, and he had terrible piles.
Have you got any examples of his English jokes or his anti-English jokes?
As it happens, I do. So this is a joke about an Englishman at a banquet. A beaker of wine was once brought to an Englishman at a banquet, and all present took their wine from it. And while the Englishman was putting it to his lips, he saw a dead fly in it, which he took out. Then, after having taken his drink, he replaced the dead fly in the wine. Asked why he did this, he replied, "I personally do not like flies in my wine, but how am I to know if some of you do?"
Not like them. And he had on the beaker. Oh, that's the first fly in my suit joke.
Exactly. There's actually an Irish joke. The earliest recorded joke about a stupid Irishman is
Really?
in his book.
The Irish captain of a merchant vessel was caught in a storm, and his ship was so buffeted and tossed by the tempest that he despaired that he would ever save her. The captain made a vow that if she was saved, that he would make an ex voto of a huge candle that would be as big as the mast of his ship. And when a friend said to him that such a vow was impossible, as there was not enough wax in all of England to make such a candle, the captain said, "Be quiet, and let me promise what I want to the Mother of God, for when we're all saved, she'll be as happy with a penny candle."
Are there any jokes that you actually laughed out loud at when you read them?
There are some excellent jokes in there, and most of them are far too filthy to be. I mean, this is the thing we haven't really talked about, and it might surprise people because obviously Poggio worked for the Pope, and there's a lot of jokes about religion in there, but it's as blue as they come.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Filthy.
Absolutely filthy.
Surprisingly, at the time the Facetiae was published, not a word of condemnation was heard from the Vatican. This was probably due to the fact that they were written in Latin, which meant they were safe to be enjoyed by the learned without corrupting the masses. Later commentators, however, were not so broad-minded. In 1802, the Reverend William Shepherd, the author of Poggio's biography, expressed his shock that an apostolic secretary who enjoyed the friendship and esteem of the pontiff should have published a number of stories which outraged the laws of decency and put modesty to the blush.
A young woman of Florence, who was not richly endowed with wisdom,
laid the white childbirth and off the peril head. Which Ray endured for a long time. The midwife took a candle and looked below to see if there's any sign of the child.
At this, the suffering woman instructed her to also look behind for the child, insomuch as her husband had on occasion also used the back road.
I think we owe Poggio a very great deal, don't you?
I think we do. Although we know that jokes do travel as part of an oral tradition, they travel from country to country and from person to person. He's the first writer to really get jokes into print. His mixture of kind of high-minded scholarship and a love of filthy jokes is a laudable one, and it makes him quite a lovable character, really.
A Florentine had in his household a young man who used to tutor his children. The tutor eventually felt so at home that he had, in turn, the housemaid, the nurse, and finally the mistress herself. The master of the house, when he discovered this, summoned the young man and said to him, "I find it unmannerly of you, sir. You take your pleasure of my entire household, and you make an exception of me?"
Poggio's influence is still around today. Have a listen to this.
A guy runs over a cat, feels really bad about it, so goes to the address on the cat's collar. A little old lady answers the door, and he says, "Look, I'm really sorry. I've run over your cat and killed it. Can I replace it?" So the old lady thinks for a while, and then she says, "How good are you at catching mice?"
Now watch this.
Matteo Franco, whose cat mewed when he pulled its ears, threw the cat out of the window, saying, "Now I will catch my own mice."
Before Poggio, you have to go back about 1,000 years to find a good joke book. But this one is the granddaddy of them all. If you think the joke you're about to see is old, you're right. But it's a lot older than you think.
Doctor, I keep hurting my arm in lots of different places. Well, stop going there then.
The joke is sometimes said to have been invented by Palamedes, the hero of Greek legend. However, as he's also credited with inventing numbers, the alphabet, lighthouses, dice, and the practice of eating meals at regular intervals, we should take that with a pinch of salt. But what we do know is that the oldest surviving joke book is from ancient Greece, and it's full of subjects we still make jokes about today. Drunk, stupid people, and the very first doctor-doctor jokes. Professor John Morgan can tell us more. John, are they funny today, some of them?
Well, there are individuals like myself who find them funny, yeah. When I try them on my students, they generally groan and roll their eyes.
Doctor, doctor, when I wake up in the morning, I feel dizzy for half an hour, then get up half an hour later.
What we learn from this is that joke telling as we would know it today goes all the way back. People told jokes back in the days of the Greeks and Romans.
We do know that there were joke books in existence, at least in the 5th century before Christ.
One man says to the other, I had your wife last night. As a husband, I have to, came the reply. What's your excuse?
What sort of people were the butts of the jokes? Because every joke has to be at the expense of somebody, doesn't it?
Well, most of the jokes in this collection are aimed at people called a scholastikos, which is a professor or a student, some kind of useless academic, so academic that he's become an idiot. But there are one or two which are aimed at ethnic targets, or people from neighbouring cities, so you can tell jokes about your stupid neighbours.
Like our Irish jokes, or the French making jokes about the Belgians, and
yeah,
the Americans about Canadians.
In Swansea we tell Llanelli jokes.
A Crimean goes to visit his friend and stands outside his house shouting for him. A neighbour sticks his head out the window and says, "Hey, shout louder, then he'll hear you." So the Crimean goes, "Oi, louder!"
What purpose do you think a joke book served? What was the need for a joke book?
One context is that these are tools for dinner parties. And we know that there was quite a widespread class of people in Rome particularly, but also in Greece, called parasites. And these were people who scrounged at the tables of rich men and earned their keep by being witty and humorous and good conversationalists.
At a woman's funeral, a stranger solemnly asks, "Who is resting here?" "I am," cried the widower, now that she's gone.
Another is it was written for circulation in barbers' shops, because a barber's shop in the ancient world was not just a place that you were in and out of in 10 minutes. It was a place where you would go and have a drink and talk to your friends and swap the gossip. And we know that it was a place where news was exchanged. So a book of jokes for him to tell his customers or for people to take to the barber's shop is quite plausible.
A barber asked his client how he'd like his haircut. In silence came the reply.
Unlike their later counterparts, the jokes in the Philagelos are short and pointed. They take on a gallery of stock characters: the doctor, the drunk, the miser, the braggart, and the scholastikos.
A scholastikos is a deep well in his own field and asks if the water is drinkable. His farmhand tells him that his parents used to drink from it. Says the scholastikos. What long necks they must have had.
There aren't too many sort of bum and willy jokes, but there are jokes about people with hernias.
Hernias, gracious. Hernias are funny in that period.
Apparently.
What did the Abderite eunuch get for his birthday? A hernia. What? A hernia? No.
There are also jokes about people with bad breath, which must have been...
No toothpaste.
No toothpaste, no dental hygiene. I imagine people just had mouths full of decaying teeth. So there's a nice joke about a man with bad breath who goes to the doctor, and he says...
So you see the cover of the jokes. Yes. Those jokes about people's shortcomings and misfortunes, aren't they, really?
It's another way of making a bond between the audience and the teller, isn't it? Against someone who is different from themselves.
Did you hear about the Abderite who heard that onions and cabbage caused wind? He took a sack of the vegetables out sailing with them and hung them from the stern.
The Philagelos was lost during the Dark Ages, and with it seemingly the art of the joke. But humour was kept alive by folk
tales which made their way over from the Middle East.
Once in Europe, they began to separate. On the one hand, with the invention of printing and the rise of literacy.
Surprisingly then, it's during Dark Ages that we find what are considered the very first English jokes.
The Exeter Codex is the oldest surviving book of English literature. Scribed by monks, it contains a vast number of religious poems which would have been chanted on sight. However, nestled amongst these are about 90 riddles, a number of which are most definitely not suitable for church.
What hangs by a man's thigh? Stiff and it's strong. And it likes to poke a hole that it's often poked before. A key.
So while the people of the 10th century might have found the Exeter riddles funny, I'm not sure they're side-splitting to today's ears. But it's good to know the monks enjoyed a good knob gag. To find out why some jokes stand the test of time and some just don't, I've come to talk to Paul MacDonald, who's made a study of the subject. He also claims to have discovered the world's oldest joke. It's amazing, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, people are telling jokes, maybe different jokes in a different way, in a different setting, but they feel the need to tell jokes and make people laugh.
How do you entertain a bored pharaoh? You get a boatload of young women dressed only in fishing nets and you sail them down the Nile. And you urge the pharaoh to go catch a fish.
The first jokes would have been practical jokes. I mean, there's a theory called the false alarm theory, which suggests that laughter was a response to something that was originally perceived as dangerous, but which turned out to be benign. So somebody would see something that they thought was a lion, their adrenaline would start pumping as a consequence of that, but it would turn out to be a donkey, and they would relax. And that relaxation was a pleasurable experience. So the earliest jokes would have been people trying to surprise people, to recreate that pleasure.
Knock, knock. Who's there? The interrupting doctor.
Interrupting
you have
doctor.
cancer.
Then when people began to develop the cerebral capacity to recreate these things in language, that's what they did in the form of jokes.
Jesus is on the gates of heaven, and suddenly he sees an old man, and he says to the old man, "What are you doing here?" And the old man says, "I'm here to find my son." And Jesus says, "Tell me more." And he says, "He was a special boy." And Jesus says, "Tell me more." And he says, "Well, he had holes in his hands and holes in his feet." And Jesus goes, "Father." The old man goes, "Pinocchio."
Have you seen a consistent thread of things that people laugh about over the centuries?
People tend to laugh at, well, sex.
I had sex with one of my old girlfriends the other night.
Really?
Yeah, she's 96.
There are lots and lots of jokes throughout the history of joking that challenge authority in various ways.
Politicians and nappies have one thing in common. They should both be changed regularly and for the same reason.
Jokes about stupidity you can find in the earliest examples
But it's
of
always it's
humour.
other people's stupidity.
Other people's stupidity.
You pick on a group of people and you make jokes about them.
Yeah, I think so. Blaming other people for the problems that any society encounters, I suppose. It tends to be humour that makes us feel better about ourselves.
Yes. Irishman fell 100 foot down a pit shaft. Wow, crash. And I shouted down to him, "Paddy, did you break anything?" He said, "No, there's nothing down here."
How important is the social context of a joke?
Well, it's crucial, in a manner of speaking. Jokes are very, very context-dependent. So, for instance, there are jokes in the earliest existing joke book that feature lettuce, for instance. Lettuce was hilarious. And if you read those jokes that feature lettuce, you won't understand why they're funny. But if you know that lettuce was considered to be an aphrodisiac 1,500 years ago, then the comic import of that material becomes obvious.
It's a Viagra joke.
They're essentially Viagra jokes, absolutely.
A Scholasticos sits down to dinner with his dad, and before them sits a huge lettuce with lots of sprouts going off it. The Scholasticos goes, "Hey, father, you eat the children, and I'll eat the mother."
How on earth do you find the world's oldest joke? What set you on the path?
Well, you have to go to the world's oldest texts. And the world's oldest texts are the texts written in cuneiform, an early form of writing, in ancient Sumer. And because humour is fundamental to the human condition, there's a very good chance that humour is going to feature in those texts, which it does. And so I look for, through the riddles and the proverbs, the short narratives, in other words, and try to identify those narratives that had incongruities of a kind that you associate with joking.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the world's oldest joke.
Something which has not occurred since time immemorial. That a young woman did not fart in her husband's embrace.
How far back can you trace that one?
Well, it's about 4,000 years old.
Is it really?
So, yes, it's 1800 BC. So one assumes that it was in circulation before it was actually documented.
What did you learn from that? What does that teach us about jokes and joke telling?
Well, it teaches us that flatulence is funny. I think there's something inherently funny.
And it's still funny.
It's still funny.
There's this guy standing in a bar having a pint. All of a sudden, he lets out this enormous fart. The man next to him taps him on the shoulder and says, "Excuse me, you've just farted in front of my wife." The guy turns around and says, "I'm really sorry, I didn't know it was her turn."
So there you have it. The world's oldest joke is a fart joke. Well, given the odd herniated eunuch and some limp lettuce leaves, I guess we're still laughing at the same stuff our ancestors laughed at thousands of years ago. As Gertrude Stein so rightly said, a joke is a joke is a joke, so long as it's funny.
A rare thing coming up on BBC 4, a smart comedy with a wonderfully cheerful vision of the world. Voted Best Comedy at the US Comedy Awards and nominated for Emmys, Parks and Recreation. Next. Stay with us.